Hi class, today we're going to be covering chapter 5, food preparation basics. And there's a lot of material in this chapter, but it's all very important for setting the groundwork for the rest of this semester, advanced food science, and also quantity foods, because you're going to learn a majority of the cooking and baking techniques that you need to know. So first, let's talk about why we heat foods. So we heat foods to destroy illness-causing microorganisms, right? We also do it because it changes the molecular structure of the food. And in return, that alters its taste, odor, texture, and appearance. And heat can be transferred to foods in two ways, basically, with moist heat or dry heat. And we're going to be talking about both of those. And this is just a disclaimer, right? Food left unattended while cooking is the #1 cause of kitchen fires. And we will not do that while we are in class together. So moist heat preparation, we'll start with this. So this is where heat is transferred by water, water-based liquid, or steam. And what it does is it softens the fibrous proteins in meats and cellulose in plants. The liquid can, if you're not using water, it can contribute to the flavor, color, texture, or appearance. So, for instance, if you are making rice, you can cook it in broth, and that will give the rice more flavor. If it's white rice, it'll change its color. And so you want to think about your liquid that you choose to cook in. So some methods of moist heat preparation are scalding, poaching, simmering, stewing, braising, boiling, parboiling, blanching, and steaming. Yeah, that's a lot. But we're going to walk through all of them. This is important. The temperature range for moist heat cooking is 150 to 240 degrees Fahrenheit. So scalding. So this is when your water reaches about 150 degrees Fahrenheit. And what results is large, still bubbles at the bottom on the sides of the pan. So we don't hear about scalding very often. The most common is scalded milk. And what happens with scalded milk is it dissolves the sugar more quickly, or melts the butter, or chocolate more easily. So then it mixes better with the flour and avoids lumps. So rarely will you hear a recipe that calls for scalded milk unless it has sugar, chocolate, or butter in it. And it'll usually be one of the first steps. It'll ask for you to scald your milk, and then that way you can dissolve your sugar or melt your butter or chocolate before you mix it with the rest of your ingredients. Scalding milk can also destroy bacteria in unpasteurized milk, and we'll talk about pasteurization a lot in our milk chapter. So poaching, this is one of the most delicate cooking methods. If you've ever made a poached egg, you know that firsthand. Poaching is done in 160 to 180 degrees Fahrenheit. So it's going to be hotter than scalding, but it's not going to be bubbling water. It's very important that you remember that. You don't want to poach in bubbling water because it's going to make whatever you're poaching just fall apart because the water molecules will be moving too rapidly. So food is partially or totally submerged in water. And this is really great for delicate foods, such as fish or eggs. So the most common you probably know is a poached egg, but you can also poach fish. Poached salmon's really good. And then another great thing to poach is pears and apples. Fruit, it can really do well with poaching, especially if you choose a delicious poaching liquid. So a lot of times poached pears will be poached in liquid that contains some cinnamon or anise, and it gives the pears that really delicious spiced flavor. So our next moist heat preparation method moving up the heat scale is going to be simmering. And this is going to be never less than 180 degrees Fahrenheit, so just below boiling. And what you're looking for with simmering is gentle rising bubbles, barely breaking the surface. So it's more gentle than boiling. They're going to be smaller bubbles, and you usually see them first around the outside and then eventually over the whole surface of the food. And so simmering is how we make rice, right? So to make rice, you bring water to a boil, you add your rice, and then you reduce it to a simmer. And by cooking it in a simmer, you are not breaking the rice particles apart, whereas with a boil, the molecules are moving very rapidly and you're at more risk for breaking them apart. So stewing is a cooking method used for meat typically, and it's in simmering ingredients in a small to moderate amount of liquid, which the liquid typically becomes a sauce, which tastes better the day after because the flavors blend together. I was actually just looking at a New York Times article, New York Times cooking, which I read probably daily, that was foods that taste better the next day. And I personally am the kind of person who has to make my meals on the weekends because I'm too busy during the week, and then we eat them left over during the week. And so I was looking for some stews because stews are one of those things that as the flavors sit together, they really do start to taste better. So one of the most famous stews is beef bourguignon. And this is a French beef stew made with red wine and herbs and beef and usually onions. It's really delicious. Julia Child is famous for her beef bourguignon. Oops, sorry. So braising is really similar to stewing. The main difference is that it's going to be in a pot that's covered, or a casserole. So typically braising, I braise in my Dutch oven, which is like a big, thick ceramic pot that can be put into the stove. It can be cooked into the oven. So it can be cooked on the top of the stove and then placed in the oven. And braising uses a small amount of liquid, whereas stewing can use a small to moderate amount of liquid. Usually with stewing, the recipe will tell you to cover the meat or whatever you're stewing in liquid, whereas with braising, you just need enough to give some liquid in the pan. And that liquid can be its own juices, if you're cooking meats especially, fat, wine, etc. And the flavors blend and intensify. So one food that's often stewed is short ribs. Braised. One food that's often braised is short ribs. And by braising it for a long period of time, you can really create a tender product. And we'll talk about like what types of meats are the best for this when we do our meat chapter. But some meats really need to be cooked for a long period of time. And with braising and stewing, you want to brown your meats first. This is going to impart the most flavor. So the way you want to do that is, brown your meats on the stovetop, add your liquid. If you're stewing, you can cook it, on your stovetop with the lid off. If you are braising, you're going to add your lid. And then sometimes the recipe will actually call for you to place it into the oven, and this allows for it to braise at a really even temperature across the whole surface. It doesn't get too hot because you're not doing it at a really high oven temperature. Whereas when you're cooking on the stovetop, it heats from the bottom up. So you might not get such an even cooking. And then braising, another key fact of braising compared to stewing is that braising is for larger pieces of meat, where stewing is for smaller pieces of meat. So where, like I was saying, that braising is going to be done for something like short ribs that are big pieces, usually with a bone intact. Stewing is going to be for something that's for like smaller bite-sized pieces. Like you actually can buy stew meat, and usually this is chuck that's been broken down. Another thing that is great for braising is actually beans. I love braised beans. So you cook them in a small amount of liquid for a long time, and they really start to fall apart. And you can add great aromatics to that, like onions and garlic, fresh herbs, and it really tastes delicious. I like to braise my beans in beer or wine. Something about the little bit of alcohol that really cuts the creaminess of the beans. Boiling is one of our biggest and most important moist heat preparations, and I'm going to remind you that boiling point is 212 degrees Fahrenheit or 100 degrees Celsius at sea level. And this is probably your most common cooking technique, where you bring liquid to a rolling boil, you add the food evenly into the water, you return it to a full boil, and then you reduce it to a gentle boil or simmer, depending on the recipe. So this is what we do for dried pastas, right? We reduce it to a gentle boil so that it doesn't boil over. With rice, we would reduce it to a simmer. And you're going to use boiling for tougher textured vegetables. And like I said, dried pastas, also dried beans is one way you can cook them. You can also soak dried beans overnight for about 8 hours, but then you're still going to want to boil them the next day. And if you are interested in more about dried beans, please let me know because I can share a really great video with you. Adding a lid helps bring water to, or whatever liquid you're boiling, faster because of increased pressure within the pot. So whenever you're bringing water to a boil on the stove, you should put a lid on it and then take the lid off to add your ingredients. If the recipe calls for you to place the lid back on, like rice, you would do so, but if not, then you're going to leave the lid off. Oops, I went the wrong way. I apologize. So boiling continued. So there's different types of boiling. So there's parboiling, and this is when you cook foods in boiling water and then finish cooking them later. So this is what a lot of restaurants do with French fries. So they'll cut their French fries, they'll parboil them, and then they'll dry them out, and then later when it's time for them to serve them, they will fry them. And this helps to get a really nice crunch on the French fries. But you have to make sure that you dry them out completely before you put them in the deep fryer. So another boiling technique is blanching. And so this is when you dip your food very briefly in boiling water. And what this will do is it'll help loosen the skin of certain fruits and vegetables or nuts for peeling. It can also destroy enzymes that contribute to deterioration. And it can make green vegetables actually more green. So what you want to do after you blanch something is you actually want to submerge it in an ice bath. And this will quickly stop the cooking process and preserve the color texture. So if you're ever making, a salad with cooked broccoli, for instance, you're going to want to do this because it's going to keep the broccoli nice and green and just make it slightly more tender than if it was raw. But always make sure you submerge into the ice bath, because if not, your vegetable or skin or a fruit, whatever it is going to keep cooking. Another thing that works really great with blanching is for peeling tomatoes. So if you have ever made a recipe that calls for plum tomatoes, sometimes it'll tell you to remove the skin, and by blanching them, you can more easily remove the skin. So here is just the difference between the size of the bubbles for a poach and a simmer and a boil. So you can really see that poaching, the bubbles are really centered at the bottom of the pot and are small. Simmering are still small bubbles, but they're kind of throughout the pot, whereas boiling is going to be rapid, large bubbles all across the pot. So another moist heat preparation method is steaming. And so this is when food is heated via direct contact with steam generated by boiling water. And this is the best cooking method for vegetables to retain their texture, color, taste, and nutrients. And you'll see that in the vegetable lab that we do. And I know that everybody goes, oh, steamed vegetables, right? But it really does allow vegetables to hold their shape, their texture, and their color the best. So how can we keep steamed vegetables from tasting bland and tasteless? We do that with adding flavor, and we'll talk about that more towards the end of the chapter and in our lab. So the direct method of steaming is when you use a rack or steamer basket over boiling water, and you cover it and allow the vegetables to cook. So you have your boiling water, you have your basket, and then your vegetables are on top, and then a lid. And that cooks the vegetables. Another way you can steam is en papillote, and this is an indirect method. And so this is when you wrap your food in foil or parchment paper just before baking. And what happens is the water in the food is released and into the packaging, and it cooks itself in its own steam. And so this is something that works really great for fish or chicken, and also vegetables too. And so a microwave incorporates both moist and dry heat methods, and we'll continue to talk about that.